Part 1. The Discovery of Thornwick Cabin. The evening mist had begun to gather in the hollows of Bramblewood Valley, curling around the ancient roots of oak and ash like ghostly fingers seeking purchase in the dying light. Meredith pulled her woolen cloak closer about her shoulders as she followed the winding path that her grandmother had shown her so many years ago, a path that seemed to exist only when the world grew quiet and the boundary between day and night became thin as gossamer. She had been walking for what felt like hours, though the light had not changed appreciably since she had left the cottage. Time moved strangely in these woods, her grandmother had always said, like honey poured on a winter morning, thick and golden and reluctant to flow as mortal minds might expect. The trees here were older than memory, their trunks so vast that 3 grown men with outstretched arms could not encompass their circumference, their crowns lost in the gathering darkness above. It was a scent that reached her first, wood smoke tinged with something indefinably wonderful, like cinnamon and starlight, and the first breath of spring all woven together. Meredith paused, her hand resting against the rough bark of a silver birch whose leaves whispered secrets in the evening breeze. The smell was coming from somewhere ahead, beyond a grove of hawthorn trees whose white blossoms glowed eerily in the twilight, as if they held captured moonbeams within their petals. Following her nose like a creature of the wild, Meredith pushed through the hawthorn grove, her skirts catching momentarily on thorns that seemed more playful than malicious. The trees parted before her with an almost ceremonial grace, and she found herself standing at the edge of a clearing she had never seen before, despite walking these woods since childhood. The clearing was perfectly circular, carpeted with moss so green and soft it seemed to glow with its own inner light. At its heart grew 2 enormous oak trees, their ancient trunks twisted together in an embrace that had lasted centuries, their branches intertwining above to form a living archway. And there, nestled between them as naturally as if it had grown from the earth itself, stood the most extraordinary cabin Meredith had ever beheld. The structure seemed to shimmer and dance in her vision, as if she were seeing it through water or heat haze. The logs from which it was built gleamed like honey in sunlight. Each one fitted so perfectly to its neighbors that not the smallest gap could be seen between them. The roof was thatched with what appeared to be golden straw, but as Meredith looked more closely, she realized the thatch moved gently in patterns too deliberate to be mere wind-stirring. Windows of clear crystal, for surely no earthly glass could be so pure, glowed with warm, amber light that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of a great, slow heartbeat. The door was perhaps the most wondrous feature of all. Carved from a single piece of what looked like ebony, it was inlaid with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and flow as Meredith watched. She could make out leaves that rustled soundlessly, stars that twinkled with silver light, and creatures so delicately wrought they appeared ready to step free from the wood itself. At the door center was a great spiral that drew the eye inward, deeper and deeper, until Meredith felt as if she might fall into its wooden depths. From the stone chimney, built of rocks so smoothly fitted they might have been shaped by ancient magic, smoke rose in a perfect spiral, carrying with it the scent that had drawn her here. But it was not ordinary smoke, Meredith realized with wonder. It was silver white and sparkled as it rose, and within its curling tendrils she could almost see shapes. Dancing figures, soaring birds, sailing ships with billowing sails that caught stellar winds. The garden that surrounded the cabin was no less magical than the structure itself. Here grew flowers that Meredith had never seen in any earthly garden. Blooms that chimed like tiny bells when the breeze touched them, vines that bore fruit of every color of the rainbow simultaneously, herbs that gave off scents so complex and beautiful, they made her head spin with their richness. A small brook babbled along the garden's edge, its water so clear and bright it seemed like liquid crystal, and Meredith could see fish swimming within it that shimmered with scales of gold and silver. As she stood transfixed by the beauty of the place, the car door began to swing open with the softest of creaking sounds, not the harsh protest of neglected hinges, but the gentle voice of well-loved was speaking its contentment. Golden light spilled out into clearing like honey poured from a celestial jar, and with it came a voice that was neither young nor old, neither male nor female, but something wonderfully beyond such simple distinctions. "Welcome, weary traveler," the voice called, warm as a hearth fire and sweet as spring rain. "The kettle has just boiled, and there are warm scones waiting, fresh from the oven and dripping with butter and honey from the hives of the golden bees of Summerland. Your feet have carried you far this evening, and your heart carries burdens that deserve rest. Come, step across the threshold, and let Thornwick Cabin offer you the hospitality it has given to wanderers since the world was young. Meredith felt herself drawn forward as if by invisible strings, her feet carrying her across the soft moss without conscious thought. As she approached the door, she could see that the golden light within was not coming from any ordinary fire or candle, but seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves, from books that lined them, from crystals that hung in the corners, from 100 sources that spoke a magic both ancient and benevolent. The threshold was carved from a single piece of white stone that seemed to glow with inner fire. As her foot touched it, Meredith felt a strange tingling sensation, as if she were stepping from one world into another, which, she would later realize, was precisely what she was doing. The air itself changed as she crossed into the cabin, becoming thicker and richer, filled with possibilities and the whispers of 1,000 stories yet to be told. Behind her, though she did not turn to see, the clearing began to fade like a dream upon waking. The hawthorn grove closing its ranks once more, the path she had followed winding itself into new configurations. But Thornwick Cabin remained, solid and real and welcoming, ready to enfold her in its timeless embrace and share with her secrets that had been waiting centuries for the right ears to hear them. The door closed behind her with a gentle sigh, and Meredith stepped fully into a world where stories lived and breathed and walked about like old friends, where books wrote themselves and tea always stayed perfectly warm, where a weary traveler could rest her heart and perhaps discover that the greatest adventures begin not with leaving home, but with finding the right place to belong. The scent of wood smoke and cinnamon and starlight wrapped around her like a grandmother's shawl, and somewhere in the golden depths of the cabin, she could hear the gentle bubbling of a kettle that had been waiting just for her, and the rustle of pages turning in books that knew her name. Part 2. The Keeper's Stories. The interior of Thornwick Cabin defied every law of architecture that Meredith had ever known. From outside, the structure had appeared cozy but modest, perhaps large enough for 3 rooms at most. Yet as she stood within its walls, she found herself in a space that seemed to stretch far beyond what should have been possible, its dimensions shifting subtly even as she watched, expanding and contracting like the breathing of some great, benevolent creature. Books were everywhere, not merely lining the walls, but filling every conceivable space with their presence. They rose in towering columns that disappeared into the shadows above, their spines creating patterns of color and texture that told stories in themselves. Some volumes were bound in leather so ancient it had taken on the deep, rich patina of centuries, their titles embossed in gold lettering that seemed to move and dance in the ambient light. Others appeared to have been bound yesterday, their covers bright and fresh, their pages crisp with the promise of new tales yet to unfold. But it was not merely the number of books that astounded Meredith. It was their behavior. Some volumes hummed softly to themselves, melodies she almost recognized threading through the air like invisible silk ribbons. Others glowed with internal light that pulsed in rhythm with some cosmic heartbeat, their covers breathing gently as if the stories within were dreaming. She watched in fascination as one particularly animated tome opened itself, its pages turning with deliberate purpose, while words appeared upon them in flowing script that glittered like captured starlight. A few books seemed to be holding conversations with their neighbors, their covers opening and closing in what appeared to be animated discourse, though no sound emerged from their whisper exchanges. In one corner, she noticed a collection of children's storybooks that had arranged themselves in a circle, apparently engaged in the literary equivalent of a tea party, their colorful illustrations occasionally spilling out to dance briefly in the air before settling back onto their proper pages. The furniture of the cabin seemed to have grown from the wood itself rather than being carved or constructed. Chairs curved in impossible spirals that nevertheless provided perfect comfort to anyone who sat within them. Tables flowed like frozen waterfalls from floor to various heights, their surfaces polished to mirror brightness and adorned with curious objects that defied immediate identification. Crystal orbs that contained swirling galaxies, hourglasses filled with sands that flowed upward instead of down, compass roses that pointed toward dreams instead of cardinal directions. In the center of this bibliographical wonderland stood a fireplace unlike any Meredith had ever seen. Built from stones that seemed to contain entire landscapes within their crystalline depths, it held a fire that burned without consuming, its flames dancing in colors that had no names. not merely blue and orange and yellow, but hues that seemed to exist only in the space between thoughts, in the pause between one heartbeat and the next. The fire cast no shadows, but instead seemed to weave light into the very air, creating patterns of illumination that shifted and flowed like visual music. Before this miraculous hearth stood the most remarkable man Meredith had ever encountered. He was tall without being imposing, his height speaking more of gentle dignity than of dominance. His hair flowed like a cascade of silver water to his shoulders, and his beard, the exact color of autumn leaves at their peak, reached nearly to his belt, which was woven from what appeared to be threads of captured moonlight. His clothing seemed to have been cut from the twilight sky itself. Deep blue fabric adorned with patterns that moved slowly across its surface like constellations wheeling through the heavens. But it was his eyes that captured and held her attention. They were ancient beyond measure, yet sparkled with the wonder of a child seeing the first snowfall. They were the color of deep forest pools where ancient secrets sleep, flecked with gold like sunlight filtering through leaves. In their depths, Meredith glimpsed a reflection of countless stories, epic tales of courage and heartbreak, gentle fables of woodland creatures, grand adventures spanning galaxies she had never imagined. These were eyes that had seen the birth of worlds and the final chapters of legends, yet still found joy in the simple pleasure of a well-told tale. "I am Aldrich," he said, and his voice was like the sound of distant thunder rolling over summer hills, rich and deep and somehow infinitely comforting. "I am the keeper of stories here at Thornwood Cabin. Every tale that has ever been told, every dream that has ever been dreamed, every song that has ever been sung, they all find their way to these shelves eventually, like streams flowing toward the sea." As he spoke, he moved with fluid grace toward a section of the vast library where tea services seemed to materialize from the very air. The teapot was wrought from silver that gleamed like captured starlight, its surface engraved with scenes that moved and shifted as Meredith watched. Tiny figures engaged in epic quests, miniature forests where microscopic creatures lived out their daily dramas, entire cities no larger than her thumb where citizens went about their business in intricate detail. The cup he offered her was carved from a single piece of crystal that seemed to contain an ocean within its translucent depths. The tea that filled its steam with aromatic vapors that carried scents of honey harvested from flowers that bloomed only in dreams, herbs gathered from meadows that existed in the spaces between sleeping and waking, spices that grew in gardens tended by beings of pure story and song. As Meredith accepted the cup, she felt its warmth spread through her hands and upper arms, carrying with it a sense of peace deeper than any she had ever known. The tea itself tasted of comfort made liquid, of Christmas mornings and birthday celebrations, of her grandmother's kitchen on baking days, of every perfect moment she had ever experienced distilled into a single, transcendent flavor. "But how is this possible?" she whispered, her voice filled with wonder as she gazed around at the impossible vastness of the library, at books that wrote themselves and furniture that breathed like living things. "How can all of this exist? How can you be real?" Aldrich smiled, and his expression held the warmth of 10,000 hearth fires. "Reality, my dear child, is far more flexible than most people believe. Stories of power, perhaps more power than any other force in all the cosmos. They shape our thoughts, our dreams, our understanding of what is possible. Here in Thornwood Cabin, we have learned to let stories exist in their purest form, unfettered by the limitations that the mundane world would place upon them." He gestured toward the self-writing books, the glowing volumes, the tomes that hummed their contentment. "These are not merely records of stories. You see, they are the stories themselves, given form and substance and the freedom to grow and change as all living things must. A story told by a grandmother to her grandchild becomes a seed that takes root here, growing into something larger and more beautiful than its original telling. A dream shared between friends finds its way to these shelves and blossoms into an entire universe of possibility." The chair in which Meredith found herself sitting had indeed molded itself perfectly to her form, its wood warm and alive beneath her touch. Around her, the books continued their gentle activities, some clustering together as if sharing gossip, others standing proudly alone in the dignity of their solitude, still others forming elaborate patterns that spoke of connections and relationships too complex for a mortal mind to fully comprehend. "Every story that has ever been told," Aldrich continued, settling into a chair that flowed up from the floor to accommodate him, Every tale that has ever brought comfort to a frightened child, every epic that has ever stirred a hero's heart, every gentle fable that has ever taught a lesson of kindness. They are all here, tended and treasured and allowed to live as they were meant to live, as if summoned by his words. Several books drifted down from the higher shelves, their covers opening to reveal pages filled with illustrations that move like living paintings. Meredith saw knights in shining armor riding through forests of silver trees, talking animals engaged in philosophical debates, fairy godmothers whose magic wands left trails of actual stardust across the pages. "But why am I here?" she asked, though part of her already suspected the answer. Could feel it resonating in the depth of her heart, like a bell struck in a distant tower. Aldrich's eyes twinkled with ancient merriment as he leaned forward, his hands clasped around a teacup that seemed to hold swirling galaxies within its ceramic depths. "Because, my dear Meredith, you carry within you a story that needs telling. And perhaps more importantly, your heart is ready to hear the stories that wait for you here. Stories that will show you truths about yourself and the world that you've been searching for without even knowing you were looking." Around them, the books seemed to settle into a deeper quiet, as if they too were listening, waiting to see which tale would choose to reveal itself to this new visitor to their sanctuary. The fire in the impossible hearth flickered with anticipation, its flameless light casting patterns that spoke of adventures yet to come, of wisdom waiting to be discovered, of the magic that happens when a story finds exactly the right person to hear it. In the golden silence that followed, Meredith could feel something stirring in the depths of her soul, a recognition, a homecoming, a sense that she had found a place she had been unconsciously seeking her entire life. The tea in her crystal cup continued to steam with aromatic vapors that spoke of distant lands and impossible adventures, and she knew, with certainty beyond doubt, that her real story was only just beginning. Part 3. The Whispering Books. As the fire settled into a deeper rhythm of golden flames and the ambient light of the impossible library grew softer and more intimate, Aldrich rose from his chair with the fluid grace of one who had learned to move in harmony with the stories that surrounded him. His robes rustled like autumn leaves as he beckoned Meredith to follow him deeper into the labyrinthine collections that filled the cabin's ever-expanding interior. They passed through sections of the library that defied logical organization, yet somehow made perfect sense. Here were shelves devoted to stories told by the wind as it moved through ancient forests. There were collections of tales whispered by rivers to the stones that lined their beds. One entire alcove housed nothing but the dreams of sleeping cats, their volumes bound in fur-soft covers that purred contentedly when touched. Another section held the unspoken thoughts of trees, their bark-bound books growing slowly but steadily as new experiences were added to their endless chronicles. The deeper they went, the more alive the books became. Meredith noticed that these volumes seemed to possess a different quality of awareness than those they had passed earlier. Where the books near the entrance had been content to exist in gentle solitude, occasionally interacting with their immediate neighbors, these books actively communicated with one another in soft, susurrating whispers that filled the air with the sound of 1,000 gentle conversations. "These are the Whispering Books," Aldrich explained, his voice taking on a tone of deep reverence as they entered a circular chamber whose walls curved upward into shadows that seemed to contain entire constellations. "They hold the stories that most closely touch the realm of sleep and dreams, the tales that slip into children's minds as they drift towards slumber, the adventures that dance behind closed eyelids, the wisdom that comes only when the conscious mind steps aside and allows deeper truths to emerge." The books in this section were bound in materials that seemed to shift and flow like captured moonlight. Some covers appeared to be made from crystallized mist, others from the deep blue essence of midnight itself. Their spines bore titles written in script that changed as Meredith watched, words forming and reforming in languages both familiar and utterly alien, as if the books were constantly rewriting themselves to be understood by whoever might be reading them at any given moment. The whispers that gave this section its name were unlike any sound Meredith had ever heard. They were not quite voices, not quite music, but something that existed in the space between the two, a form of communication that bypassed the ears entirely and spoke directly to the soul. She could almost understand what they were saying, could catch fragments of meaning that flitted through her consciousness like half-remembered dreams. Some books whispered stories of brave children who ventured into dark forests and found them filled with friends rather than fears. Others murmured tales of lonely stars that learned to shine more brightly by connecting with their celestial neighbors. Still others shared whispered secrets about the magic that exists in ordinary moments, the way dust motes dance in afternoon sunlight, the symphony created by rain on a roof, the ancient wisdom held in the curl of a cat's contented sleep. As they moved through this whispering wonderland, Meredith became aware that the books were responding to her presence in ways both subtle and profound. Volumes that had been resting quietly on their shelves began to glow more brightly as she passed. Others leaned forward slightly, as if trying to catch her attention. A few actually stepped partially free from their places, revealing themselves to be not bound books at all, but creatures made of living story, their pages forming wings that fluttered like those of literary butterflies. One particularly magnificent tome caught her attention, a volume that seemed to be bound in the essence of starlight itself, its cover shifting between deep midnight blue and silver that sparkled with the light of distant suns. Unlike its neighbors, this book did not whisper. Instead, it hummed with melodies so beautiful and haunting that Meredith felt tears gathering in her eyes without understanding why. The book's title was written in letters that flowed like liquid music across its cover, The Secret of the Singing Mountains. As Meredith read these words, they seemed to resonate in her mind, awakening memories she had never formed and homesickness for places she had never been. The very air around the book shimmered with possibility, and she could smell something that reminded her of high mountain air, clean and sharp and filled with the promise of vast, open spaces. "Ah," said Aldrich, his ancient eyes lighting up with recognition, and something that might have been anticipation. "This one has been waiting for you, Meredith. I have watched it for decades, growing more restless with each passing year, as if it knew that someday the right person would come to hear its story. Books, you see, are not passive things. They choose their readers as much as readers choose them." As if responding to his words, the book began to glow more brightly, its silver clasps shaped like miniature mountains with tiny crystals for peaks, clicking open of their own accord. The cover lifted slightly, revealing pages that seemed to be made from pressed flower petals that had somehow been transformed into finest parchment, each sheet glowing with its own soft, internal light. "But why this story?" Meredith asked, her hand hovering over the book's cover as if she feared to touch something so beautiful it might dissolve at her touch. "What makes it mine?" Aldrich smiled, and in his expression she saw the accumulated wisdom of countless stories told and retold, of infinite tales shared between teller and listener across the span of ages. Stories choose us for reasons that often become clear only in the telling. Perhaps this tale holds wisdom you need to hear. Perhaps it contains an adventure your heart has been secretly craving. Or perhaps you are meant to carry this story back into the world beyond these walls, to share its magic with others who need to hear it. Around them, the other whispering books had grown quieter, as if they too were anticipating the opening of their long-waiting companion. The very air in the chamber seemed to hold its breath, charged with the potential energy of a story about to unfold. Crystalline formations that jutted from the curved walls began to chime softly, creating a harmony that seemed to welcome the coming tale. "Shall we see what story holds?" Aldrich asked gently, his hands poised to fully open the waiting volume. Meredith nodded, and as she did, she felt something shift inside her, a recognition that she was about to cross another threshold, to step from being merely a visitor to this magical place to becoming an active participant in the stories that lived here. The crystal cup still warm in her hands, the taste of impossible tea still sweet on her tongue. She watched as Aldrich carefully opened the book to its first page. The moment the pages parted, the chamber around them began to dissolve like watercolors in rain, its solid walls becoming translucent, then transparent, then fading entirely. The whispers of the other books grew distant, though not unfriendly, more like the sound of wind through distant trees, a gentle backdrop to what was about to unfold. The circular room, the curved walls, even Aldrich's chair began to shimmer and fade, replaced by something vast and impossible and breathtakingly beautiful. Meredith found herself no longer sitting in a library, but standing on solid ground, though the ground beneath her feet felt different from any earth she had ever known. It was resilient and alive, pulsing gently with what she could only describe as contentment. The air that filled her lungs was crisp and clean, carrying scents of snow and pine and something indefinably magical that made her feel as if she could run for miles without growing tired. Above her stretched a sky unlike any she had ever seen, deep and vast and filled with stars that seemed close enough to touch. But it was not the sky that took her breath away. It was the mountains that surrounded her, rising in magnificent peaks that seemed to scrape the very heavens, their slopes covered in forests that glowed with their own soft light. And from every mountain, from every hill, from every stone and tree and blade of grass, came music, a harmony so complex and beautiful that it seemed to encompass every song ever sung, every melody ever hummed, every rhythm ever felt by a beating heart. The mountains themselves were singing, their voices deep and resonant and filled with the joy of creatures who had found their perfect purpose in the cosmic symphony of existence. Beside her stood a figure she had not noticed before, small and dignified, with bright copper hair that caught the starlight like spun metal and eyes that reflected the same deep contentment that emanated from the singing earth beneath their feet. The little being wore robes that seemed woven from moonbeams and carried a staff topped with a crystal that chimed in harmony with the mountain songs. "Welcome," the figure said, and his voice was like distant thunder rolling through valleys of dream and wonder. "I am Pip, guardian of the evening song. We have been waiting for you to hear our story, to understand the music that keeps our world alive and bright. But I fear our song is in danger, and we need help from someone whose heart carries its own music. Will you listen to what the mountains have to say?" As his words echoed across the singing landscape, Meredith realized that she was no longer merely reading a story or watching unfold. She had become part of it, woven into its fabric as surely as a melody becomes part of a symphony. The book's magic had transported her not just to another place, but into another way of being, where stories were lived rather than simply told. The mountains continued their magnificent chorus, but now she could hear a discordant note threading through their harmony, something dark and wrong that made the very stars above flicker with concern. Whatever story she had become part of, she sensed that it would require more than passive listening to reach its resolution. She would need to act, to choose, to become the hero of her own adventure. With the crystal cup still somehow warm in her hands and the memory of Aldrich's wise eyes to guide her, Meredith stepped forward into the singing landscape, ready to discover what role she was meant to play in the tale of the mountains and their guardian, ready to learn what wisdom this ancient story held for her heart. Part 4. The Singing Mountains. The meadow in which Meredith found herself was unlike any natural landscape she had ever experienced. The grass beneath her feet was not ordinary grass at all, but something far more wondrous. Each blade seemed to be crafted from crystallized moonlight, creating a carpet that chimed softly with every step she took. The sound was not harsh or jarring, but rather like the gentle tinkling of wind chimes made from the purest silver, each note perfectly pitched to harmonize with a vast symphony that filled the air around them. The mountains that encircled this enchanted meadow rose like ancient cathedrals built by gods who understood the true meaning of majesty. Each peak was unique in its song. Some hummed deep, thrumming bass notes that seemed to emerge from the very bones of the earth, while others sang in crystalline soprano voices that soared toward the star-filled sky like prayers made audible. The highest peaks, their summits crowned with snow that glowed with its own ethereal light, wove intricate harmonies that spoke of ages beyond counting, of wisdom accumulated through millennia of patient observation. As Meredith listened more closely, she began to distinguish individual melodies within the greater symphony. The mountain directly before her, its slopes covered in forests of silver-leaf trees, sang a gentle lullaby that made her think of her grandmother's voice humming her to sleep on stormy nights. Another peak, this one adorned with waterfalls that cascaded like liquid starlight, contributed a bright, joyous melody that spoke of spring mornings and the laughter of children at play. But it was not only the mountains themselves that sang. Every element of this magical landscape contributed its voice to the endless chorus. The trees swayed in rhythms that added percussion to the mountain songs, their silver leaves rustling in patterns too complex and beautiful to be mere chants. Streams wound through the meadow, their waters babbling in counterpoint melodies that wove in and out of the greater harmony like silver threads through a cosmic tapestry. Even the flowers that dotted the crystalline grass participated in the music. As Meredith watched in fascination, blooms of every color imaginable opened and closed their petals in time with the melodies, creating visual harmonies that complemented the auditory symphony. Some flowers actually chimed like tiny bells when they opened, while others released puffs of luminescent pollen that danced in the air like musical notes made visible. The creatures of this realm were perhaps the most remarkable of all. Tiny beings no larger than a thumb flitted through the air on wings of gossamer light. Not quite fairies, for they were too wild and free for such a domesticated term, but something more primal and ancient. These creatures sang in voices like the distant tinkling of silver bells, adding their own ethereal harmonies to the endless song. They seemed curious about Meredith, circling around her with movements that traced musical patterns in the air, their flight paths creating visual melodies that hung momentarily in space before dissolving into sparkling dust. Larger creatures moved through the distant forest with grace and dignity that spoke of intelligence far beyond that of ordinary animals. She glimpsed what might have been deer, if deer could be made of living starlight and move with the fluid grace of dancers. Their hoofbeats as they bounded across distant slopes added rhythmic elements to the mountain symphony, each step precisely timed to enhance rather than interrupt the greater harmony. Birds, or creatures that serve the same function as birds in this impossible realm, soared between the peaks with wings that seemed to be woven from solidified music. Their songs were not the simple melodies of earthly birds, but complex compositions that told stories of wind currents and cloud formations, of the secret conversations that passed between stars, of the ancient friendships that existed between mountains who had stood together since the world was young. But despite all this beauty, despite the overwhelming sense of rightness and harmony that pervaded every aspect of this musical landscape, Meredith could not shake the feeling that something was amiss. It took her several minutes of careful listening to identify what troubled her. Certain notes were missing from the great symphony, leaving gaps in a harmony like missing teeth in a smile. The music was still beautiful, but it was incomplete, wounded somehow, as if a great instrument in an orchestra had fallen silent and left its part unfilled. Pip, who had been standing quietly beside her, allowing her time to absorb the wonder of his realm, finally spoke again. His voice carried the weight of ancient sorrow, though it remained warm and welcoming. "You hear it, don't you? The silence where sound should be. The missing voices in our eternal song." Meredith nodded, her heart already heavy with sympathy for whatever loss had befallen this magical place. "Some of the mountains aren't singing," she said softly. "I can feel the empty spaces in the melody where their voices should be." "Indeed," Pip confirmed, his crystal-topped staff chiming mournfully as he gestured toward a section of the mountain range where several peaks stood in ominous quiet. These mountains were not dead. She could see that life still moved upon their slopes, that trees still grew and streams still flowed down their sides. But they stood mute and gray, their song stolen or silenced by some terrible force. "Long ago," Pip began, settling himself upon a boulder that hummed contentedly at his touch, when the world was younger and the boundaries between dreams and waking were even thinner than they are now, the first singers came to our mountains. They were beings of pure music, creatures who existed as living melodies given form and consciousness. They taught our peaks their songs, not imposed them, you understand, but helped each mountain discover its own unique voice, its own perfect contribution to the greater harmony. As he spoke, images seemed to form in the air around them, projected somehow by the combined will of the singing mountains. Meredith saw figures of impossible beauty moving among the peaks, tall, graceful beings who seemed to be made of crystallized sound, their forms shifting and flowing like visible music. She watched them approach each mountain with reverence and patience, listening to the deep, wordless desires of the stone itself before helping give voice to its innermost nature. Each mountain learned a different song, Pip continued, his eyes reflecting the starlight as he gazed up at the peaks that still sang. The eastern range learned the songs of sunrise and new beginnings, melodies that helped the world wake each morning with joy and purpose. The western mountains took up the evening songs, harmonies that guided the sun to rest and helped all living things find peace at the end of each day. The southern peaks learned the songs of growing things, melodies that encouraged seeds to sprout, flowers to bloom, trees to reach toward the light. The images in the air shifted, showing the mountains in their full glory, their songs visible as streams of colored light that flowed between the peaks, weaving together into patterns of such beauty that Meredith felt tears gathering in her eyes. The harmony had been complete then, she realized, every voice perfectly placed, every melody supporting and enhancing every other melody. creating a symphony that could have played for eternity without ever becoming tiresome or repetitive. "And the northern peaks?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Pip's expression grew even more sorrowful. The northern peaks learned the lullabies, the deep, gentle songs that helped all the world's children sleep peacefully, that wove pleasant dreams and kept nightmares at bay. Their melodies were perhaps the most precious of all, for they guarded the most vulnerable hours of every day, the time when consciousness rested and the soul was most open to both wonder and terror. The images showed her these northern mountains as they had been, their peaks crowned with aurora light, their songs flowing down into the valleys below like benevolent mist that brought rest to the weary and comfort to the troubled. She could almost hear their lost lullabies, could imagine how they had once wrapped the entire world in a blanket of peace as each day drew to its close. What happened to them? Meredith asked, though she dreaded the answer. "The shadow weavers came," Pip replied, his staff's crystal dimming, as if even speaking of them reduced the light in the world. "Creatures born from the spaces between notes, from the silence that exists in the pauses between melodies. They are not evil in the way mortals understand evil. They are simply beings of negation, of emptiness, of the void that exists where music should be." The images in the air grew darker now, showing twisted forms that seemed to be made of crystallized silence, creatures whose very presence caused nearby sounds to wither and fade. They moved like living shadows across the landscape, but shadows that consumed light rather than being cast by it. Emptiness given form and terrible purpose. They envied the mountains their songs, Pip explained. The shadow weavers exist in eternal silence, cut off from the great harmony that connects all living things. In their loneliness and pain, they began to steal music wherever they could find it. First from small creatures, then from streams and trees, and finally from the mountains themselves. Meredith watched in horror as the shadow forms crept up the slopes of the northern peaks, their touch causing the very stones to grow gray and silent. The mountain songs faltered and died as the creatures wove webs of crystallized silence around the peaks, trapping their voices in nets of nothingness. "But surely the other mountains fought back?" she asked. Surely their combined voices could have driven away these creatures of silence. Pip shook his head sadly. Music cannot fight silence through force. Such an attempt only creates discord, which served the Shadow Weaver's purpose. The remaining mountains could only watch as their northern brothers fell silent one by one, their lullabies trapped in webs that grew stronger with each stolen note. The meadow around them seemed to grow dimmer as Pip finished his tale, as if the very telling of it had diminished the light that emanated from the singing grass. The mountains continued their wounded symphony, but now Meredith could hear clearly the gaps where the northern lullaby should have joined the eternal chorus. The world itself was incomplete without those gentle songs, she realized. Harsher somehow, more prone to nightmares and restless sleep. "And now?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew why she had been brought into the story. Pip turned to her with eyes that held both desperate hope and ancient wisdom. Now the Shadow Weavers have grown bold. They are no longer content with the northern peaks. They have begun to move south, to spin their webs of silence around the sunset songs and the dawn melodies. If they succeed, if they steal all our voices, the world will fall into eternal silence. Dreams will cease, music will die, and the great harmony that holds all things together will collapse into nothingness. He rose from his boulder and approached her, his small form radiating dignity despite his diminutive stature. "But you, Meredith, carry music within your heart. I can hear it. A melody that the Shadow Weavers have never encountered, a song that comes not from stone or stream or growing thing, but from the human spirit itself. Perhaps your music might be the key to freeing our trapped lullabies and restoring the great harmony." As his words echoed across the singing meadow, Meredith felt a stirring deep within her chest. Not fear, but something far more powerful. Purpose. Destiny. The recognition that she had been brought to this place not as a passive observer, but as a participant in a story that would determine the fate of music itself. The crystal cup still warm in her hands, she looked up at the silent northern peaks where webs of crystallized silence caught the starlight like malevolent jewelry, and she knew that her real adventure was about to begin. Part 5. The Journey Through Shadow Valley. The descent from the singing meadow into Shadow Valley began as twilight deepened around them. Though in this realm of living music, twilight was not the absence of light, but rather its transformation into something more mysterious and profound. The crystalline grass beneath their feet gradually gave way to ordinary earth, though even this transition felt significant, as if they were leaving behind a realm of pure possibility and entering a place where darker realities held sway. Pip led the way with careful, measured steps, his crystal-topped staff providing both illumination and a subtle musical counterpoint to their journey. The staff's chimes grew more subdued as they descended, as if it too understood the gravity of their mission and the dangers that lay ahead. With each step they took away from the singing mountains, the great symphony that filled the air grew more distant, though never completely fading. It remained as a constant reminder of what they were fighting to preserve. The path they followed was ancient beyond measure, worn smooth by countless generations of mountain dwellers who had traveled between the peaks in happier times. Carved into stone at regular intervals were symbols that Pip explained were musical notations, not the simple marks used by human musicians, but complex three-dimensional patterns that captured entire symphonies in their crystallized forms. These wave markers were created during the time of the first singers, Pip explained as they paused beside one particularly elaborate carving that seemed to pulse with inner light. Each symbol contains an entire composition. Songs of welcome for travelers, melodies of protection for those who journeyed in darkness, harmonies of courage for those who faced difficult tasks. In the old days, these carvings would sing aloud to guide and comfort travelers. Now, he touched the carved stone with his small hand, and though the symbol brightened slightly at his contact, no sound emerged from its crystalline depths. The silence was more profound for the promise of music that hung unfulfilled in the air around them. As they continued their descent, Meredith began to understand more fully the nature of the world she had entered. This was not simply a place where music existed. It was a realm where music served the same function that physical laws serve in her own world. The songs of the mountains were not mere entertainment or even art in the human sense, but fundamental forces that kept the very fabric of reality stable and whole. The trees that lined their path demonstrated this clearly. Those closest to the singing peaks swayed in perfect harmony, their movements creating visual rhythms that complemented the distant mountain songs. Their leaves rustled in patterns too complex to be random, adding layers of gentle percussion to the cosmic symphony. But as they walked further into Shadow Valley, the trees began to move differently. Their swaying became erratic, their leaf songs fragmented and discordant. Some stood unnaturally still, as if frozen in fear of what lay deeper in the valley. The Silence Weaver's influence grows stronger as we approach their realm, Pip observed, noticing Meredith's attention to the troubled trees. Music is the life force of our world. Where songs fail, all things begin to lose their essential nature. Plants forget how to grow in harmony with the seasons. Streams forget the ancient melodies that guide their flow to the sea. Even the stones forget the deep, patient songs that hold them together. This explanation filled Meredith with a profound sense of the responsibility that rested upon her shoulders. She was not simply on a quest to restore lost lullabies. She was part of an effort to preserve the very essence of order and beauty in this musical cosmos. The weight of this realization should have been crushing, but instead, she found it oddly comforting. For the first time in her life, she felt as if she were exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do. As they walked, Pip began to share more of his people's history, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadences of an ancient storyteller. The mountain dwellers, he explained, were not born but rather grew from the music itself, formed when particularly beautiful melodies became so complex and complete that they achieved consciousness and took physical form. I myself, he said with mixture of pride and humility, emerged from an evening song that had been sung by the Sunset Mountains for over 1,000 years. The melody grew more elaborate with each passing day, adding verses and harmonies and instrumental interludes, until one twilight it became aware of its own beauty and chose to walk upon the paths between the peaks. This revelation helped Meredith understand the deep connection between Pip and the musical landscape around them. He was not simply a guardian of songs. He was literally made of music, a living embodiment of the harmonies he protected. The sadness in his eyes when he spoke of the Silence Mountains was not just sympathy for their plight, but genuine physical pain, as if part of his own essential nature had been torn away. Other mountain dwellers had once populated these paths, Pip explained. Each one formed from different aspects of the great symphony. There have been dawn singers who awaken with the sunrise melodies, storm walkers who dance with the wild songs of wind and rain, and deep listeners who carry the bass notes of the earth itself. But as the shadow weavers had stolen more and more music from the mountains, these musical beings had begun to fade, their forms becoming translucent and finally dissolving entirely as the melodies that gave them existence were trapped in webs of silence. Am I the last? Pip asked the question rhetorically, but Meredith could hear the profound loneliness behind his words. I persist because the evening songs still flow from the western peaks, but each day I feel myself growing fainter as more music is stolen from our world. Soon, I too may dissolve into the silence, leaving the mountains to face the shadow weavers with no guardian at all. The path began to steepen as they descended deeper into the valley, and the quality of the air around them changed dramatically. Where the mountain meadows had been filled with the sweet scents of musical flowers and singing streams, the air here grew thick and oppressive, carrying odors that seemed to be the olfactory equivalent of discord. Not quite unpleasant, but wrong somehow, as if familiar scents had been subtly altered in ways that made them disturbing rather than comforting. More troubling still was the way sound behaved in this deeper part of the valley. Their footsteps, which should have echoed naturally off the rocky walls, seemed muffled and distorted. When Meredith spoke, her words reached Pip's ears a moment later than they should have, as if the very air was reluctant to carry sound from one place to another. The distant mountain songs, which had provided a constant backdrop to their journey, now came to them in fragments, a melody line here, a harmony there, never quite complete enough to provide the comfort and guidance they were meant to offer. The Shadow Weaver's influence is strong here, Pip explained, his own voice sounding strangely hollow in the disturbed air. They have been spinning their webs of silence for so long that the very atmosphere has become infected with their nature. Sound itself becomes confused, uncertain of its proper behavior. As if to demonstrate his point, a bird called from somewhere in the trees above them, but the sound arrived before the bird opened its beak and then echoed backward through time, creating a disorienting temporal loop that made Meredith's head spin. Even more unsettling was the way her own humming seemed to fracture as it left her lips, breaking into component parts that arrived at Pip's location at different moments, turning her simple melody into a jarring cacophony. Try not to make any unnecessary sounds, Pip advised gently. The closer we get to the heart of their realm, the more dangerous it becomes to create music. The Shadow Weavers can sense musical vibrations from great distances, and they are drawn to them like moths to flame. But unlike moths, they do not seek to join the light. They seek to extinguish it. This warning made their journey even more surreal, as they were forced to move in unnatural quiet through a landscape that had once rung with constant song. Meredith found herself holding her breath unconsciously, afraid that even the sound of her breathing might attract unwanted attention. The crystal cup she still carried had grown cold in her hands, and she noticed that the magical tea within it no longer steamed, as if even the simple physics of heat and evaporation were disrupted by the influence of the Silence Weavers. As the path wound between increasingly jagged rocks that seemed to absorb rather than reflect sound, they began to encounter the first direct evidence of the Shadow Weaver's presence. Stretched between the stone outcroppings were webs that defied easy description. They were not made of silk or any physical substance, but appeared to be woven from crystallized absence, from the spaces between sounds made manifest and solid. These webs caught not flies or other insects, but something far more precious. Musical notes that had been torn from their proper context and trapped in silvery prison strands. Meredith could see fragments of melodies suspended in the sticky filaments, individual notes that pulsed with faint light as they struggled to break free and return to the songs from which they had been stolen. Some of the trapped music was clearly from the mountain lullabies, deep, soothing tones that even in their imprisoned state made her feel drowsy and peaceful. But other notes were more recent captures, fragments of dawn songs and sunset melodies that must have been stolen from the still-singing peaks in recent raids. The sight of these musical prisoners filled Meredith with a righteous anger that surprised her with its intensity. "How can we free them?" she whispered, reaching toward one particularly large web where an entire phrase of melody hung trapped like a gossamer butterfly. "Carefully," Pip warned, catching her hand before it could touch the silken strands. "The webs are more than simple traps. They are designed to capture any music that touches them. If you were to sing or hum near one of these snares, your melody would be torn from your throat and added to their collection. And if you were to touch the web directly, he shuddered, unable to complete the thought. They moved more cautiously now, picking their way between the musical traps with the care of travelers navigating a minefield. Each web they passed contained its own collection of captured sounds. Some held the gentle babbling of streams, others the rustle of leaves or the distant call of birds. One enormous web stretched across their entire path, forcing them to crawl beneath it on hands and knees while trying not to disturb the musical treasures trapped above their heads. As they emerged from beneath this obstacle, Meredith realized that the webs were not randomly placed but formed a deliberate pattern, a maze designed to funnel intruders toward a specific destination. The realization sent a chill down her spine. They were not simply traveling to the Shadow Weaver's territory, but walking directly into a carefully constructed trap. "Pip," she whispered urgently, "I think they know we're coming." The little mountain dweller nodded grimly, his crystal staff dimming to barely a glimmer to avoid attracting attention. "I suspect they have known since the moment we entered their realm. The Shadow Weavers are ancient creatures, and they understand the nature of stories as well as we do. They know that heroes must eventually come to challenge them. It is the way of all tales. But knowing that we must come and being prepared to face us are two different things entirely." Ahead of them, the valley opened into a wider space where the darkness seemed to pool like liquid shadow. At its heart, they could see something that made both of them stop in their tracks, a structure so vast and intricate that it defied immediate comprehension, a web so enormous and complex that it seemed like a cathedral built from crystallized silence, its spires reaching toward the star-hidden sky like the fingers of some cosmic hand stretched out to grasp the very concept of sound itself. And moving within that structure, barely visible as shifting patches of darkness against the already dark night, were the Shadow Weavers themselves, creatures of such alien nature that Meredith's mind struggled to process what her eyes were seeing. They moved like living voids, like spaces where reality had simply chosen not to exist, and in their wake, even the memory of music seemed to fade from the world around them. Part 6. The Web of Silence. At the heart of Shadow Valley, where the darkness gathered like a living thing with hunger and intention, stood the most magnificent and terrible structure Meredith had ever beheld. The Web of Silence rose before them like a cathedral constructed not of stone and mortar, but of crystallized absence, a monument to negation that defied every natural law while simultaneously being undeniably real and present. The web's construction was both beautiful and horrifying in its complexity. Its strands were not the simple radial patterns of an earthly spider's creation, but something far more sophisticated, a three-dimensional mandala of interconnected spirals and geometric forms that seemed to extend both upward into the star-hidden sky and downward into dimensions that Meredith's mind could not quite grasp. The material which it was woven appeared to be pure silence given substance, threads that absorbed light and sound with equal hunger, creating corridors of nothingness that hurt to look at directly. But it was what hung caught within these strands that truly broke Meredith's heart. Thousands upon thousands of musical notes were trapped there, each one glowing with faint, desperate light as it struggled against its crystalline prison. She could see entire melodies stretched across sections of the web. Phrases of the mountain lullabies that had once sung the world to peaceful sleep, fragments of dawn songs that had greeted each new day with hope and joy, pieces of the sunset serenades that had helped travelers find rest at the end of long journeys. The trap music was not merely stored within the web. It was being slowly consumed, its essential nature drained away to feed some incomprehensible hunger. As Meredith watched in horror, she could see notes gradually losing their luminescence, their pure tones becoming muddy and discordant as their life force was siphoned away. Some sections of the web held only the empty husks of what had once been beautiful melodies, crystalline shells that had been sucked dry of their musical essence. The scale of the theft was staggering. This was not the work of mere years, but of decades or perhaps centuries of systematic harvesting. Every stream song that had ever guided water to the sea, every bird call that had ever announced the arrival of spring, every lullaby that had ever eased a child into peaceful sleep, all of it was here, trapped and slowly dying in this monument to silence. Near the base of the great web, moving between its support strands with fluid grace, were the Shadow Weavers themselves. Meredith had expected them to be creatures of obvious menace, beings whose evil nature would be immediately apparent. Instead, she found herself looking at entities so alien that her mind struggled to process their nature. They were not dark in a way that night is dark. They were absence itself given form and movement, spaces where reality had simply chosen not to exist. Each shadow weaver moved like a patch of nothingness that had learned to walk, their forms constantly shifting between visible darkness and complete transparency. They had no fixed shape, but rather flowed like liquid shadow, sometimes appearing almost humanoid, other times resembling creatures that might have existed in the gaps between thoughts. When they moved close to the trapped music, the notes would dim further, as if their very presence was antithetical to the concept of sound itself. At the center of this vast web, suspended in what appeared to be a throne made from the crystallized silence of 1,000 stolen symphonies, sat the largest and most complex of the Shadow Weavers. This was clearly their leader, a being so ancient and powerful that its mere presence seemed to create distortions in the fabric of reality around it. Unlike its companions, who appeared as patches of mobile darkness, this creature had achieved a more stable form. Tall and eerily graceful, with limbs that seemed to be constructed from braided silence and eyes that were not eyes at all, but rather wells of absolute emptiness that hurt to look upon. "The Chief Weaver," Pip whispered, his voice barely audible even to Meredith, who stood right beside him. "It is older than the mountains themselves, born in the first moments when the cosmos learned the concept of silence. I had hoped it might have moved on to some other realm, left our music in peace. But it seems our songs have become too precious for it to abandon." As if sensing their presence, the Chief Weaver's terrible non-gaze turned in their direction. For a moment that felt like eternity, those empty eyes fixed upon them with an attention so complete and alien that Meredith felt her very sense of self beginning to dissolve. This was not merely a predator looking at potential prey. This was something far more fundamental, a force of negation examining the patterns of existence itself and finding them wanting. But instead of the attack that Meredith expected, the Chief Weaver began to speak. Its voice was unlike anything she had ever heard. Not sound in any conventional sense, but rather the absence of sound given meaning. Words formed from the spaces between syllables, communication that bypassed the ears entirely and spoke directly to the deepest levels of consciousness. "Why do you come to our sanctuary, little makers of noise?" the voice asked, though asking seemed inadequate to describe away the meaning simply appeared in Meredith's mind. "Why do you disturb the perfect quiet we have worked so long to achieve?" The question was not hostile, which somehow made it even more disturbing. There was genuine curiosity in that terrible voice, as if the Chief Weaver truly could not understand why anyone would prefer the chaos of sound to the purity of silence. This was not a creature driven by malice, but by a philosophy so alien to Meredith's understanding that it might as well have been evil. "We have come to ask you to return what you have taken," Meredith found herself saying, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "The music you have captured belongs to the world. The mountains need their songs. The streams need their babbling melodies. The children need their lullabies." The Chief Weaver's form shifted, becoming more solid and defined, as if her words had given it greater substance. When it spoke again, there was something that might have been amusement in its terrible tone. "Taken? Child of flesh and noise, we have taken nothing. We have liberated these sounds from their bondage to chaos and meaning. Here, in our perfect web, they exist in their purest form, no longer burdened by the necessity of conveying emotion or serving the needs of lesser beings. Here they can simply be, eternal and unchanging, preserved forever in crystalline perfection." As it spoke, the web around them seemed to pulse with dark light, and the trapped music glowed more brightly for a moment before dimming again, as if the Chief Weaver's words were somehow draining them of additional vitality. Meredith could see now that this was not simple theft. It was a form of twisted preservation, a desire to collect and catalog beauty, while simultaneously destroying its essential nature. "But music is meant to be heard," she protested, taking a step forward despite Pip's restraining hand on her arm. "It's meant to bring joy and comfort, to connect one heart to another. Trapped like this, it's not really music anymore, it's just emptiness wearing the shape of songs." The Chief Weaver rose from its throne of crystallized silence, its form growing larger and more imposing as it unfolded to its full height. A Around them, the other shadow weavers stopped their work and turned to observe this confrontation, their patch-like forms clustering closer to the web center. Emptiness, the chief weaver repeated, and now there was definitely something like hurt in its alien voice. You speak of emptiness as if it were something to be feared or despised, but we are the first children of the cosmos, born in the perfect silence that existed before the first note was ever sounded. We remember the peace that came before the chaos of music, the wholeness that existed before sound fractured the universe into countless discordant pieces. As it spoke, images began to form in the air around them, visions projected by the combined will of all the shadow weavers. Meredith saw the cosmos as they saw it, not as a symphony of interconnected harmonies, but as a great silence that had been wounded by the intrusion of sound, a perfect void corrupted by the addition of meaningless noise. We do not steal, the chief weaver continued, its voice growing stronger and more resonant with each word. We heal. We return the universe to its proper state, one note at a time. Each song we collect brings us closer to the restoration of the great silence, the perfect peace that existed before creation learned to make noise. The alien logic of this philosophy struck Meredith with unexpected force. From the Shadow Weaver's perspective, they were not destroyers but healers, not thieves but librarians preserving beauty in the only way they understood. The tragedy was not that they were evil, but that they were so fundamentally different from the musical beings they opposed that peaceful coexistence seemed impossible. "But you're in pain," she said suddenly, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "You're not destroying the music because you hate it. You're destroying it because it hurts you to hear it, because it reminds you of something you've lost or something you never had." The chief weaver's form wavered, becoming less solid, more transparent. For the first time since they had encountered it, the creature seemed uncertain, vulnerable. Around them, the other shadow weavers began to move restlessly, their patch-like forms shifting and flowing with what might have been agitation. "Pain," the chief weaver whispered, and the word carried such profound loneliness that Meredith felt tears gathering in her eyes. "Yes, child of flesh and noise. Music hurts. It speaks of connections we cannot make, of harmonies we cannot join, of a universe filled with voices that we can never truly hear. In the silence, we can pretend that we are not alone. In the silence, we can imagine that the emptiness within us is simply the natural state of all things." The confession hung in the air between them, like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Meredith could see now that the shadow weavers were not conquerors but refugees, not destroyers but the deeply wounded, creatures so isolated by their fundamental nature that they had convinced themselves that isolation was preferable to the pain of failed connection. Pip stepped forward, his crystal staff chiming softly in the oppressive silence of the valley. "But what if music doesn't have to hurt?" he asked gently. "What if there were songs that could include even creatures of silence, melodies that could bridge the gap between sound and emptiness?" The chief weaver turned his terrible gaze upon the small mountain dweller, and for a moment, Meredith held her breath, afraid that Pip's boldness might provoke the creature to violence. But instead of anger, she saw something that might have been hope flickering in those empty eyes. "Impossible," the chief weaver said, but its voice lacked conviction. "We are antithetical to sound itself. Our very nature destroys music wherever we go. We cannot create harmony. We can only achieve peace through the elimination of all sound." It was then that Meredith understood what she needed to do. The crystal cup, which had remained warm in her hands throughout their entire journey, suddenly felt almost hot against her palms. The tea within it, that magical brew that tasted of comfort and belonging in every perfect moment she had ever experienced, began to steam once more, despite the oppressive atmosphere of the Shadow Valley. "Let me show you," she said softly, raising the cup to her lips and taking a sip of the impossible tea. As the liquid touched her tongue, she felt her voice strengthen, felt the melody that had always lived within her heart beginning to rise like sunrise after the longest night. And very gently, very carefully, she began to sing. Part 7, The Healing Song. The song that emerged from Meredith's lips was unlike anything she had ever sung before. It began as a simple melody, wordless and pure, rising from the depths of her heart where it had been waiting, perhaps all her life, for this moment of perfect necessity. The notes that flowed from her were not the complex harmonies of the mountain songs, nor the elaborate compositions of the trapped lullabies, but something far more fundamental. The sound of one soul reaching out to another across the vast emptiness that separates all conscious beings. As her voice gained strength, something extraordinary began to happen to the oppressive atmosphere of Shadow Valley. The air, which had been thick and resistant to sound, began to lighten and clear, as if her melody was burning away the accumulated layers of silence that the Shadow Weavers had woven into the very fabric of the place. The darkness that pooled around the great web started to shift and swirl, not retreating but somehow becoming less absolute, less impenetrable. The Chief Weaver's reaction was immediate and dramatic. The creature's form, what had seemed so solid and imposing moments before, began to waver like heat shimmer, becoming translucent and then almost completely transparent. But instead of fleeing or attacking, it remained perfectly still, its terrible emptiness eyes fixed upon Meredith with an attention so complete that she could feel it like a physical weight. "Stop," the Chief Weaver whispered, but the word carried no command, only desperate pleading. "Please stop. It hurts. The sound, it makes us remember." But Meredith did not stop. Instead, she allowed her melody to grow more complex, adding layers of harmony that seemed to spring from the air around her. The other Shadow Weavers, who had been moving restlessly through their web, began to slow their motions, their patch-like forms becoming more stable, more defined. Some of them had begun to glow with a faint, silvery light. Not the harsh illumination of trapped music, but something softer, warmer, more welcoming. As her song continued, the trapped notes within the great web began to respond. At first, just a few of the brightest melodies started to pulse in rhythm with her voice, their crystalline prisms resonating with sympathetic vibrations. Then more joined in and more, until thousands of captured songs were humming in harmony with her simple melody, creating a chorus so beautiful and complex that it seemed to remake the very air through which it traveled. But the most remarkable change was in the Shadow Weavers themselves. As Meredith's song wove through the valley, the creatures began to transform. Their forms became less chaotic, more coherent, and she could see that what she had taken for emptiness was actually a different kind of fullness. They were not voids in reality, but spaces where different laws applied, where silence could exist as a positive force rather than mere absence. The Chief Weaver was undergoing the most dramatic transformation of all. Its towering form was becoming more solid, more present. And as it did, Meredith could see that it had once been beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with conventional ideas of beauty. It was a being of crystallized quiet, of the peaceful pause between breaths, of the perfect moment of stillness that comes just before sleep. It was not the enemy of music at all, but rather music's necessary complement, the silence that gave meaning to sound, the rest that made melody possible. "I remember," the Chief Weaver said, and its voice was no longer the terrible absence of sound that had first addressed them. It had become something richer, deeper. The sound of snow falling on quiet forests, of stars wheeling in their courses of void, of the deep contentment that comes with perfect rest. "I remember what I was before the pain began." As it spoke, its form continued to stabilize and clarify, revealing features that were both alien and somehow familiar. It was tall and graceful, with limbs that seemed to be carved from crystallized moonlight and a face that held the serene beauty of a perfectly still lake reflecting infinite stars. Its eyes were no longer empty voids, but clear as mountain springs, filled with ancient wisdom and a sadness so profound that it took Meredith's breath away. "I was not always a creature of negation," it continued, its voice growing stronger and more melodious with each word. "Long ago, before the universe learned to sing, I was the guardian of the sacred pause, the one who taught the cosmos the value of silence, the necessity of rest between notes. Without me, all music would be cacophony, an endless wall of sound with no structure, no meaning, no beauty." The other Shadow Weavers had gathered around their transformed leader, and Meredith could see that they too were changing. Their patch-like forms were resolving into beings of light and shadow balanced in perfect harmony. Creatures who existed not to destroy sound, but to give it meaning through the gift of strategic silence. But something went wrong, the Chief Weaver said, its crystalline features reflecting the growing light from the resonating web above them. As the universe filled with more and more music, as every stone and stream and blade of grass learned to sing, the spaces for silence grew smaller and smaller. We became refugees in our own cosmos, driven to the dark places where sound feared to go. Pip stepped forward, his own crystal staff now chiming in harmony with Meredith's continuing song. "And in your pain and isolation, you forgot your true purpose," he said gently. "Instead of creating meaningful silence, you began to impose emptiness. Instead of teaching the value of the pause between notes, you began to steal the notes themselves." The Chief Weaver nodded, a gesture so filled with sorrow and recognition that Meredith's heart ached for the lonely eons it had endured. We convinced ourselves that all music was our enemy, that the only way to find peace was to eliminate sound entirely. We built these webs not to preserve beauty, but to satisfy our own hunger for the silence we had lost. We became the very thing we had been created to prevent, destroyers of harmony rather than its guardians. As understanding dawned, something even more remarkable began to happen. The trapped music in the great web was not simply resonating with Meredith's song. It was beginning to work in concert with the transformed shadow weavers to create something entirely new. The creatures who had once been dealers in crystallized absence were now contributing their own voices to the growing symphony, adding not silence but strategic pauses, meaningful rests, spaces that gave the melodies room to breathe and grow. The result was more beautiful than any music Meredith had ever imagined. The mountain lullabies, freed from their crystalline prisons, began to sing again, but now they were enhanced by perfectly placed moments of quiet that made their soothing power even greater. The dawn song sparkled with renewed brilliance, their joy magnified by the contrast with gentle pauses that felt like the held breath of anticipation before sunrise. Even the sunset serenades gained new depth and meaning, their peaceful melodies interwoven with silences that spoke a contented sigh of a day well lived. "This is what we were meant to be," the Chief Weaver said, its voice now a perfect complement to Meredith's ongoing song. "Not the enemies of music, but its most essential partners. Not destroyers of harmony, but the creators of the spaces that allow harmony to exist." As the great web continued to resonate with their combined voices, its structure began to change. The crystalline strands that had once imprisoned stolen music were transforming into something else entirely, a vast instrument of impossible beauty and complexity, each strand calibrated to produce perfect silence when needed, perfect resonance when called upon. Instead of trapping sound, it now shaped it, creating chambers and corridors where melodies could echo and grow, where harmonies could find their proper relationships to one another. The smaller shadow weavers were no longer moving randomly through the structure, but with purpose and grace, each one taking up a position where their particular gift for meaningful silence could best serve the greater composition. They had become the conductors of this cosmic orchestra, the ones who decided when each voice should sing and when it should rest, when harmonies should blend and when they should stand apart in solitary beauty. "But how did you know?" the Chief Weaver asked Meredith, its transformed voice filled with wonder. "How did you understand what we truly were, when we ourselves had forgotten?" Meredith paused in her singing, though the music continued around them without her voice, sustained now by the combined efforts of freed melodies and redeemed silence weavers. "I think," she said slowly, "it was because I recognized the loneliness. I felt it too, that sense of being cut off from the music that everyone else seems to hear naturally, of being too different to fit into the songs that surround us." She looked around at the transformed valley, where darkness and light now danced together in perfect balance, where silence and sound had learned to be partners rather than enemies. "But tonight I learned that being different doesn't mean being excluded. Sometimes it means being exactly what the music needs to become complete." The Chief Weaver stepped down from its throne, which was no longer a seat of crystallized silence, but a podium from which it could conduct the vast symphony that filled the valley. As it moved, Meredith could see that its form had stabilized into something both beautiful and functional, still tall and graceful, still possessing otherworldly dignity, but no longer radiating the terrible emptiness that had made it so frightening. "Will you teach us?" it asked, extending a hand that gleamed like captured starlight. "Will you show us how to be part of the music again, how to contribute our gifts without destroying the songs of others?" Meredith took the offered hand without hesitation, and the moment their fingers touched, she felt the most extraordinary sensation. Not the cold emptiness she had expected, but a warmth that was different from any she had ever known. It was a warmth of perfect rest after exhausting labor, of the peaceful pause between one breath and the next, of the moment of absolute quiet that comes just before the first note of a beloved song. "We can learn together," she said, and as she spoke, she felt her own understanding of music deepening and expanding. She was beginning to comprehend that true harmony required not just a blending of compatible sounds, but the wise placement of silence, the strategic use of pause and rest to give meaning and structure to even the most beautiful melodies. Around them, the great web continued its transformation, becoming not a trap, but a cathedral of sound and silence, a place where music could exist in its most perfect and complete form. The mountain lullabies that had been imprisoned for so long were now free to flow back to their proper peaks, but they carried with them new wisdom about the power of strategic quiet, new understanding of how silence could enhance rather than diminish their soothing power. And in the center of it all, former enemies had become collaborators, working together to create something more beautiful than either could have achieved alone, a harmony that encompassed not just sound but silence, not just music but the meaningful spaces between notes, not just the joy of singing, but the peace of perfect, chosen quiet. Part 8. The Great Harmony Restored. As the last echoes of Meredith's healing song faded into the transformed atmosphere of Shadow Valley, something magnificent began to happen. The freed melodies, no longer trapped in crystalline webs, but enhanced by the strategic silences of their former captors, began to rise into the star-filled sky like luminous spirits finally able to return home after years of exile. Each melody took on a visible form as it ascended. Ribbons of pure light that danced and spiraled through the air carried with them not just their original songs, but the wisdom they had gained through their imprisonment and liberation. The mountain lullabies rose as streams of deep blue and silver radiance, their gentle harmonies now enriched with perfectly placed pauses that made their soothing power even more profound. The dawn songs sparkled like captured sunbeams as they soared upward, their joyful melodies interwoven with moments of anticipatory silence that spoke of the held breath before the first bird call of morning. But these were not the same songs that had been stolen so long ago. Each melody had been transformed by its experience, made more complex and beautiful by its encounter with the Shadow Weaver's gift for meaningful silence. They carried within them a new understanding of the delicate balance between sound and quiet, a wisdom that would make them more powerful and effective when they returned to their rightful places in the cosmic symphony. The transformation was not limited to the songs themselves. The entire landscape of Shadow Valley was changing as the liberated music flowed through it. The oppressive darkness that had pooled in every hollow and crevice began to lift and dissipate, not banished but transformed into the gentle dimness of twilight, the comfortable shadows that make lamplight warm and starlight bright. The air, which had been thick and resistant to sound, became clear and resonant, carrying each note with perfect fidelity, while providing spaces for silence that enhanced rather than muffled the music. Even the rocky walls of the valley were responding to the return of harmony. Stones that stood mute and gray for decades began to glow with inner light, their crystalline structures resonating with the frequencies of the ascending songs. Ancient mineral formations that had grown in perfect silence now discovered their capacity for music, adding their own deep, thrumming bass notes to the growing symphony. The chief weaver stood in the center of this miraculous transformation, its crystalline form now radiating a soft, silver light that complemented rather than competed with the golden radiance of the freed melodies. As the song spiraled upward around it, the creature began to conduct their ascension, its graceful movements guiding each melody toward its proper destination with the skill of a master musician who had finally remembered their true calling. "Listen," Pip whispered, his crystal staff chiming in harmony with the ascending music. "Can you hear beginning?" At first, Meredith wasn't sure what he meant. The immediate area was filled with the sound of rising melodies and the soft whisper wind through the transformed valley. But as she focused her attention beyond the local symphony, she began to detect something far more profound, a deep, thrumming response from the mountains themselves. The sound began as a barely perceptible vibration, a bass note so low it was felt rather than heard. But gradually, it grew stronger and more defined, and Meredith realized she was listening to the voice of the northern peaks themselves, awakening from their enforced silence as their stolen lullabies returned home. The sound was like the contented sigh of giants settling into comfortable sleep, like the deep breathing of the earth itself as it prepared for a peaceful rest. As the first mountain found its voice again, others began to follow. Peak after peak emerged from silence, each one adding its unique contribution to the growing chorus. But these were not the same mountain songs that had existed before the Shadow Weaver's reign. They were richer, more complex, enhanced by their reunion with the strategic silences that gave them structure and meaning. The lullabies, in particular, had gained a power and beauty that surpassed their original form. Where once they had simply soothed listeners to sleep, they now carried within them the deeper wisdom of rest and renewal, the understanding that silence was not the absence of music, but its most essential partner. Children who heard these enhanced lullabies would not merely sleep. They would rest in profound peace that comes from perfect harmony between sound and quiet, between activity and rest, between the day's songs and the night's gentle pause. But the restoration was spreading far beyond the northern peaks. As the liberated melodies reached their destinations, they began to reconnect with the songs that had never been stolen, creating new harmonies and relationships that enriched the entire musical ecosystem of this magical realm. The dawn songs of the Eastern Mountains found new depth when paired with strategic pauses taught to them by the reformed Shadow Weavers. The sunset serenades of the Western Peaks discovered new variations and elaborations as they learned to incorporate meaningful silences into their evening compositions. Even the streams and forests were responding to the restoration. Waters that had babbled in simple, repetitive patterns for decades suddenly remembered more complex melodies, their voices weaving in and out of the mountain songs with sophisticated counterpoint arrangements. Trees that had swayed to basic rhythms began to move in intricate patterns that created visual symphonies to complement their auditory contributions. The creatures of this musical realm were perhaps the most dramatically affected by the restoration. Tiny flying beings, those gossamer-winged entities that were neither quite fairies nor quite birds, emerged from hiding places where they had sheltered during the years of silence weaving. They filled the air with their crystalline voices, adding high, ethereal harmonies to the mountain songs that made the entire symphony sparkle with otherworldly beauty. Their flight patterns traced musical notation in the air, creating visible melodies that danced between the audible ones. Larger creatures began to appear as well. Beings of living starlight that had once danced between the peaks but had hidden themselves away when the music began to disappear. They emerged now from caves and hidden valleys, their forms shimmering with renewed joy as they took up their roles in the cosmic dance. Their movements added visual rhythm to the audible symphony, creating a performance that engaged every sense and touched the deepest levels of consciousness. But perhaps the most remarkable participants in this restored harmony were the Shadow Weavers themselves. No longer creatures of negation and emptiness, they had taken up positions throughout the valley and beyond, each one serving as a conductor of silence, a guardian of the strategic pauses that gave meaning to the songs around them. They moved with grace and purpose, their crystalline forms creating patterns of meaningful quiet that enhanced every melody they touched. The Chief Weaver had assumed a position at the highest point of the transformed web, which had become a magnificent conducting podium from which it could coordinate the complex interplay of sound and silence across the entire realm. Its gestures were both commanding and gentle, guiding the great symphony while allowing each voice its individual expression within the greater harmony. "This is more beautiful than it ever was before," the Chief Weaver called out to Meredith, its voice now a perfect complement to the music around them. "The harmony we have created together surpasses anything that existed in the time before our exile. We have learned something new about the nature of music itself, that its greatest power comes not from sound alone, but from the perfect balance between singing and silence." As if in response to these words, the entire symphony began to shift and grow, becoming more complex and sophisticated with each passing moment. New harmonies emerged as different sections of the mountain range discovered unexpected connections with each other. Rhythms that had never existed before rose spontaneously from the interplay between reformed Shadow Weavers' strategic silences and the natural pulses of stream and wind and growing things. Pip had begun to glow more brightly, his form becoming more solid and defined as the restored harmony strengthened his connection to the musical forces that had created him. "I can feel others awakening," he said, his voice filled with wonder and joy. The dawn singers who faded when the sunrise melodies were weakened, they were forming, taking shape again from the enhanced songs of the eastern peaks. The storm walkers had dissolved when the wind songs grew discordant, They're returning as the air itself learns new harmonies. Indeed, throughout the realm, musical beings who had faded during the years of silence weaving were beginning to reappear. Creatures formed from pure melody stepped forth from the songs that created them, their forms more stable and beautiful than ever before thanks to the strategic silences that now gave structure to their essential music. The population of this magical realm, which had been reduced to a single guardian of the evening song, was being restored and expanded beyond its original numbers. But the restoration was not simply a return to the past. It was an evolution into something entirely new and unprecedented. The collaboration between the mountain songs and the reformed shadow weavers was creating forms of music that had never existed before, harmonies that incorporated the wisdom learned through centuries of separation and conflict. The great harmony that now filled the air was richer, more complex, and more beautiful than anything that had come before. As the symphony reached new heights of complexity and beauty, Meredith felt herself beginning to fade from the vision, as if the story that had drawn her into this musical realm was reaching its natural conclusion. The transformed valley grew translucent around her, and she could see the familiar shapes of Thornwick Cabin beginning to reappear through the singing mountains. But before the vision completely dissolved, the chief weaver approached her one last time, its crystalline form now radiating warmth and gratitude rather than the terrible emptiness that had first greeted her. "Thank you," it said, and in those simple words was contained the gratitude of countless beings who had been restored to their true nature. "You have given us back not just our purpose, but our joy. The harmony we create now will echo through all the worlds, bringing peace to sleepers and meaning to music wherever it is heard." As the musical realm faded around her and the walls of Aldrich's impossible library reformed, Meredith carried with her the echo of that great harmony, a symphony that would continue to play in her heart for the rest of her life, reminding her always of the power of understanding, the necessity of balance, and the magic that happens when apparent enemies discover they were meant to be partners all along. Part 9. The Gift of Stories. The transition from the musical realm back to Thornwick Cabin was so gentle that at first Meredith wasn't entirely certain it had happened. The echoes of the great harmony still resonated in her heart and mind, the memory of crystalline mountains and reformed shadow weavers as vivid as if she had never left that magical landscape. It was only when she felt the familiar warmth of the comfortable chair beneath her and saw the golden glow of the impossible fireplace that she realized the story had released her back into Aldrich's library. But something fundamental had changed within her during her journey through the tale of the singing mountains. She could feel in the way her breath moved in rhythm with harmonies that no longer played aloud, in the way her heartbeat seemed to pulse in perfect time with melodies that existed now only in memory. The story had not simply been told to her. It had become part of her, woven into the very fabric of her being in ways that would influence every song she would ever sing, every silence she would ever choose to embrace. The crystal cup was still warm in her hands, though the magical tea within it had transformed during her journey. Where once it had tasted of comfort and familiar joys, now it carried flavors that spoke of deeper wisdom, the bittersweet understanding that comes from seeing enemies revealed as lost friends, the complex satisfaction of harmony restored not through conquest but through compassion. Each sip filled her not just with warmth, but with a profound sense of completion, as if a part of her that had always been missing had finally been found and integrated. Aldrich sat across from her, his ancient eyes reflecting the firelight as he carefully closed the glowing book that had contained their adventure. The secret of the singing mountains settled back onto its shelf with a contented sigh, its covers no longer shimmering with urgent need, but glowing with the peaceful radiance of a story that had found its proper audience and delivered its intended message. "Every tale has its own wisdom to impart," Aldrich said gently, his voice carrying the same warm authority that had first welcomed her to the cabin. "Some stories teach us about courage in the face of obvious danger, others about the power of love to overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. But the rarest and most precious stories are those that teach us about the magic that happens when we choose understanding over judgment, compassion over conquest." Meredith nodded, still feeling the resonance of the great harmony in her bones. "I thought it would be a story about defeating the Shadow Weavers," she admitted, "about driving them away or destroying them to save the music. I never imagined that the real solution would be helping them remember who they were meant to be." "The most powerful victories," Aldrich observed, rising from his chair with fluid grace, are those that transform enemies into allies, that heal ancient wounds rather than inflicting new ones. You discovered tonight that the Shadow Weavers were not evil beings who hated music, but lost souls who had forgotten their essential role in creating it. In teaching them to remember their true nature, you didn't just restore the mountain songs, you made them more beautiful than they had ever been before. As he spoke, he moved toward a section of the library that Meredith had not noticed during her earlier exploration. This area was different from the others, less crowded with books, more focused on individual, precious volumes that seemed to glow with a special significance. The shelves here were made of wood so old and well-loved that it seemed almost alive, and the books they held appeared to be works in progress, their pages still being written by invisible hands. These are the personal collections, Aldrich explained, running his fingers along the spines of several volumes whose titles shifted and changed as she watched. Books that belong to specific individuals, stories that are being lived rather than simply told. Each person who visits Thornwood Cabin and truly engages with one of our tales earns a place here, a volume that will record not just their adventure within our walls, but the ways that adventure changes and enriches their life in the world beyond. He withdrew a slender volume bound in leather the color of moonlight on water, its cover unmarked but somehow radiating potential. As Meredith watched, words began to appear on its surface. The Chronicles of Meredith, written in script that seemed to flow like liquid music across the binding. "This is yours," he said, offering her the book with the same reverence he had shown when handling the ancient story that had transported her to the Singing Mountains. "It will record your adventures, both the ones you have within these walls and the ones you will live when you return to your own world. But more than that, it will serve as a reminder of the wisdom you have gained, the music you'll learn to hear, the harmony you have discovered between sound and silence." Meredith accepted the book with trembling hands, feeling its warmth and weight as if she were holding a piece of her own soul made manifest. The cover was smooth as silk beneath her fingers, and she could sense vast possibilities contained within its pages. Not predetermined fate, but infinite potential waiting to be explored through the choices she would make in the days and years to come. "But I haven't done anything yet," she protested. "I haven't lived adventures worth recording, haven't accomplished anything important in the world beyond this cabin." Aldrich's eyes twinkled with the accumulated wisdom of centuries spent guiding visitors through transformative stories. "My dear child, you just learned one of the most important lessons the universe has to teach. That understanding and compassion can heal even the deepest wounds, that apparent enemies often need only to be reminded of their true nature to become the most valuable allies. That wisdom will influence every interaction you have, every choice you make, every song you sing for the rest of your life." As if to emphasize his words, the book in her hands began to warm, and she felt a gentle tingling sensation as the first pages filled themselves with text. She caught glimpses of her own story being written, not just her journey through the tale of the Singing Mountains, but the events that had led her to Thornwood Cabin in the first place, the thoughts and feelings that had prepared her to receive the story's wisdom. "Stories of power beyond the telling," Aldrich continued, settling back into his chairs of fire, and the impossible hearth shifted to even warmer, more golden hues. "They shape our understanding of what is possible, influence our choices in moments of crisis, provide us with frameworks for making sense of experiences that would otherwise overwhelm us. The story you have lived tonight will become part of who you are, and through you, it will touch the lives of everyone you encounter." He gestured toward the vast library surrounding them, where thousands of books continued their gentle activities, writing themselves, humming softly, glowing with inner light, conversing with their neighbors. Every tale in this collection was once lived by someone like you, someone who was brave enough to open themselves to transformation, wise enough to see beyond surface appearances, compassionate enough to seek understanding rather than victory. From a shelf nearby, he selected another volume, this one bound in leather the color of autumn leaves, its title reading The Art of Carrying Stories. He opened it to a page filled with diagrams and illustrations that seemed to move and dance across the parchment. "This will teach you how to share the wisdom you have gained," he said, offering her the book, "not by simply retelling the story you experienced, though that too has its place, but by carrying its essence within you, allowing its lessons to inform your actions, letting its harmony influence the way you move through the world." The second book settled comfortably in her lap, alongside her personal chronicle, and she could feel the knowledge contained within it beginning to integrate with her own understanding. She began to comprehend how stories worked as living entities, how they spread from person to person not through mere repetition, but through transformation, each telling shaped by the teller's own experiences and understanding. "Will I remember all of this when I leave?" she asked, suddenly fearful that the vivid reality of her experience might fade like a half-remembered dream once she stepped back into the ordinary world. "You will remember exactly what you need to remember," Aldrich assured her with a gentle smile. "The details may shift and change, as all memories do, but the essential wisdom will remain. More importantly, the transformation you have undergone tonight is not something that can be forgotten or undone. You are no longer the same person who stumbled upon our cabin in the twilight. You're someone who has learned to hear the music that underlies all existence, someone who understands the delicate balance between sound and silence that makes harmony possible." As he spoke, the cabin around them began to glow more brightly, and Meredith realized that her visit was drawing to its natural close. The books on the shelves seemed to rustle with gentle farewell, and even the fire in the hearth flickered in what she could only interpret as a friendly goodbye. But instead of sadness at leaving this magical place, she felt a deep sense of completion, as if she were not ending an experience but beginning a new chapter of her life. "There is one more gift," Aldrich said, rising from his chair and moving toward a small writing desk that materialized in the golden air as he approached it. From its drawer, he withdrew a fountain pen that seemed to be carved from crystallized starlight and a small bottle of ink that swirled with colors that had no names. "For your own stories," he explained, offering her these tools with the same ceremonial gravity he had shown throughout their encounter. "The pen will never run dry, and the ink will always flow true. Use them to record not just the adventures you have, but the quiet moments of beauty, the small acts of kindness, the harmony you discover in everyday life. Those too are stories worth preserving, tales that can bring light to others who walk similar paths." Meredith accepted the writing implements, feeling their power and potential as clearly as she had felt the warmth of the magical tea. The pen fit her hand perfectly, as if it had been crafted specifically for her, and the ink bottle pulsed gently with rhythm that matched her own heartbeat. "Now," Aldrich said, moving toward a carved door that would lead her back into the ordinary world, "it is time for you to begin the greatest adventure of all, the one where you take the wisdom you have gained and use it to make your own world a little more musical, a little more harmonious, a little more understanding of the balance between sound and silence that makes beauty possible." The door swung open, revealing the moonlit forest where her journey had begun. But the trees no longer seemed ordinary. She could hear the subtle songs they sang to each other in the wind, could see the harmony in their swaying branches, could feel the deep rhythm that connected all growing things in an endless, living symphony. As she stepped across the threshold, carrying her 2 precious books and her crystalline writing tools, Meredith felt the cabin beginning to fade behind her, not disappearing, but returning to the hidden state where it waited for the next traveler who needed the gift of transformation that only the right story, told at the right time, could provide. The path through the woods was clear before her, illuminated not just by moonlight, but by the inner glow of understanding she now carried within her. And as she walked toward home, she began to hum, a simple melody that seemed to arise spontaneously from her heart, a song that wove together the lullabies of the northern peaks, the strategic silences of the reformed shadow weavers, and her own unique voice in a harmony that had never existed before but felt as natural and necessary as breathing. Behind her, though she did not turn to see, Thornwick Cabin settled back into its timeless patience, its golden windows still glowing warmly among the guardian oaks, ready to welcome the next soul who needed to discover that the greatest adventures begin not with leaving home, but with learning to hear the music that has been surrounding us all along.